Hey guys, the Wolf Den here, and today we'll be taking a look at the Bretonnian Standard Bearer on Royal Pegasus for games of Warhammer the Old World and games of Warhammer Fantasy. Let's get into it. Have ye ever gazed upon a Pegasus with your own two eyes, lad? Beautiful creatures they are. Their coats sparkle in the sunlight like the rays of the sun on new-fallen mountain snow. Their wings are like the great eagles, and by grungy, did you see them dive and swoop so easily? I've yet to see a gyrocopter do that. Ulrich Ironpick, Dwarf Ranger, and Mountaineer. The Pegasus is one of the old world's most beautiful and mysterious creatures. Born to the high peaks of the old world, particularly in the Grey Mountains, groups of Pegasi, as they are called, often gather in large social groups and herds to live out their days soaring and flying in their mountain homes. But what exactly is a Pegasus, one might ask? A Pegasus is, in essence, a large, majestic horse that is born with a pair of wings that grows throughout its lifetime, allowing it to soar, coast, and swoop through the air with such grace and agility that one might mistake it for a bird at a distance. These wings are believed by some scholars of the various schools of magic to operate by riding on the very winds of magic themselves in order to fly. This is, however, but one working theory, as Pegasi physiology is very close to that of the birds whose wings that they share, and they simply may use their powerful bodies and wings to soar naturally through the air, without the use of the winds of magic's effects at all. Groups of Pegasi often compete with other mountain creatures, such as the hippogriff, which is a fusion of bird and horse, wyverns, and griffins, for nesting places and resources in the high peaks they call home. And additionally, it should be noted that Pegasi are omnivores, which means that it will eat both plants and meat that it can find in its habitat. And despite its regal and majestic appearance, it certainly isn't picky. Pegasus can often be found throughout the peaks of the old world. And due to these different environments and the magic that surrounds them, various subtypes of these beautiful animals have been found and documented by the various scholars of the numerous civilizations of the world. These include the dangerous dark Pegasi, who are famously used by the dark elves and hunger for the flesh of men, twisted by chaos itself into a gruesome parody of its once regal form. Additionally, there are the beautiful and otherworldly radiant Pegasi of Araby, able to use the sun's heat as a weapon against its enemies. And finally, the most sought after yet rarely obtained are the Royal Pegasi, the most beautiful and the pinnacle of their species. Some have argued that the Pegasi's most useful trait, outside of its ability to fly, is that it's a powerful potential mount. Many in the old world have tried to claim one of these noble creatures as a steed for battle, but few succeed. The most common practice of obtaining a Pegasi mount is the theft of young foals from their nests high in the mountains, in order to be reared properly and in order for them to accept a rider. As adult Pegasi are considered nearly untamable, it takes roughly a year for a foal to mature into an adult. And if done correctly with compassion and trust, a Pegasus that has reached adulthood is an extremely loyal mount for those who have tamed it. Compared to the more aggressive griffin and the malicious wyvern, the Pegasus is an intelligent creature, and if raised with care and love, a Pegasus will willingly offer help and take a rider, compared to some more aggressive choice of steeds throughout the animals of the old world. There exist numerous subtypes of Pegasus, as previously mentioned. However, the most special and rare are by far the Royal Pegasi. A Royal Pegasus is said to be the most proud, the most noble, beautiful, and intelligent of all the Pegasi subspecies, and are whispered to be the most pure out of all Pegasi. Only the most rich and influential of nobles of the various civilizations of the old world could even dream of owning such a creature, as their rarity is only on par with their price, and they often become the most prized possession of those who are able to afford one. Their owners form a special bond with these mounts, who often treat these majestic creatures as peers of equal worth in their own right. And in the kingdoms of Bretonnia, for example, dukes, lords, and other nobles who have such creatures often have knight-errants in their own retinue personally care for these steeds while not in use. Lords of Bretonnia and paladins have all been seen using these impressive creatures. Sometimes armies of Bretonnia are led by dukes on these noble steeds, while in some cases, paladins may carry the standard of their armies on top of these creatures' backs, as they charge headlong into the fray. It is their job to rally their fellow soldiers and knights against the horrors and nightmares of the old world. And what better place to do it than on the back of a majestic Royal Pegasus, wings spread wide, rearing in power, as their foes flee from their impressive might. There have been many types and models of Pegasus throughout Warhammer Fantasy's iterations over the years, with numerous types of models being produced by Games Workshop as Warhammer Fantasy evolved. Much like in their lore, Pegasi often act as mounts for generals or famous characters within the Warhammer Fantasy setting, as well as the old world. The first recorded instance of a Warhammer hero riding on a Pegasus is seen here, which is the Imperial Hero on Pegasus, was released in December of 1991, making it Games Workshop's first official Pegasus model. The next iteration of the Pegasus model would be released in April of 1994. This time was a high elf riding on a regal-looking Pegasus, with a rather elaborate-looking saddle. 1994 would also feature the rather tiny Bretonnian Pegasus rider for Games of War Master, an epic fantasy game featuring massive armies from the Warhammer world rendered in small scale. It should be noted that the Dark Elves also received 2 Dark Pegasi models during this time. However, the Dark Pegasi themselves are rendered with fearsome-looking bat wings, as well as having an overall evil-looking sculpt compared to their normal Pegasus cousins. 1998 would see the release of the gorgeous Bretonnian Duke on Pegasus, which would also be followed in 2000 by Balthasar Gelt himself, the Supreme Patriarch on his Pegasus. War Master would also receive another Pegasus model for the Bretonnians, this time in the form of the hero model on Pegasus in 2001, before finally the classic Bretonnian Pegasus Knights would release in 2004, which would be re-released under the Warhammer the Old World tagline as well, for Games of Warhammer the Old World. Almost 20 years later, the Bretonnians, as well as the Pegasi themselves, would receive stunning new models in the form of the Bretonnian Lord on Royal Pegasus, as well as the Battle Standard Bearer on Royal Pegasus, which is the model we'll be taking a look at today in this review. So here we have the gorgeous, beautiful Battle Standard Bearer on Royal Pegasus for the Kingdoms of Bretonnia armies for Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer the Old World. I have to say, I love the bright blue box that the Old World packaging has gone with. It's a refreshing change from the normal grim and dour dark colors of the other Warhammer Ranges boxes, and it really catches the eye, and I really like the color choice that they picked here. The Games Workshop monster design team for both Age of Sigmar and the Old World seemingly always smash it out of the park with making these amazing creatures. I saw this model immediately after not having known much about Bretonnia in general, and I knew I had to pick this up. We have a full photo of the Standard Bearer himself on the Pegasus, showing off those giant wings and the standard itself, as well as a hand-drawn illustration of the Standard Bearer on the Pegasus to the left here. I love this art style as well. It reminds me a lot of the old Warhammer illustrations, and I think they're a great and eye-catching inclusion to the front of the box. Flipping the box over, we have another full view of the model itself. It's really full of detail, from its hooves to its head. The rider himself is also similarly detailed. And here we have a note that says this box allows you to make one Bretonnian Paladin Battle Standard Bearer on Royal Pegasus. Try saying that 5 times fast. Additionally, we have a few zoomed in shots of the flag itself. Which one thing I like about this kit is that the flag itself is completely blank. No hard transfers are permanently glued to the flag itself, which is really nice, especially if your army is using custom-made symbols or transfers like mine will be. It also shows a close-up of some of the smaller detail parts, which is unfortunately one of my problems with this kit, which we will get into later, as well as a zoomed-in shot of the reins, which putting these together in this model was absolutely a nightmare, which we will also be discussing later. Also included is a small paint guide and a photo of the Kingdoms of Bretonnia transfer sheet. So starting with the contents of the box, we have the instructions, and this is the first of many issues that I have with this kit. Like a lot of creature models, given that there are no flat lines or angles when assembling these, they often require a lot of exact fits in order to go together properly. I had a similar issue while putting together Karl Franz on his Deathclaw Griffin. The instructions are definitely of not much help here, as the instructions do not offer a very helpful guide in putting this model together at all. The instructions are incredibly basic, and I mean that in the sense of, what, did this model come out in 2005? Levels of basic in terms of the instructions. There are barely if any alternate views or angles, and it is really only helpful in a few places to get the general idea of how the parts go together, rather than how to actually assemble the model. I would highly recommend not following a lot of the steps as they're shown here, as both mount and rider are incredibly detailed, and having the rider on the Pegasi glued permanently for painting would be an excruciating experience. I would absolutely recommend keeping the rider unglued from the saddle in order to paint him and the banner properly. On that note, do not put the back part of the saddle on before you glue the rider to the saddle itself. For some reason, they made it so the rider will not fit once this piece is installed. You certainly have an easier time using your intuition here to actually get it together. While the parts are numbered, and I will give them that, they really don't help much as the numerous parts of the horse, especially the mane and some of the smaller details, are nearly identical in shape. And putting them on in the suggested order will only lead to more frustration. Next, we have the Bretonnian transfer sheet. Nothing too fancy here, just a bunch of basic black and white symbols. I've seen photos of the older Bretonnian transfer sheets, and honestly it feels like we lost something here, with those being full color with a variety of symbols and hard to paint details. These are fairly basic and really only help if you planned on using these two types of symbols. Next, we have our first sprue. An interesting fact, this kit shares 90% of its parts with the Duke on Royal Pegasus kit. I really wish that they had included the Duke parts in this model for a bit more variety. Why split them up into two kits? I don't know. So, in this case, the Pegasi is exactly the same as that Pegasi that comes in that kit. The details here, however, are very nice. The wings on the horse are incredible and they look very lifelike, with individual layers of feathers being presented here. That being said, some of the other problems with this kit come from it being a bit too detailed in a few places, especially on the Pegasi itself. But we'll talk more about that later. The next sprue we have is the Standard Bearer himself, which, much like his mount, is full of detail, which is certainly a bit of a double-edged sword, as there's almost too much detail in some places that have a tendency of snapping or breaking even during assembly. I will give credit where credit is due. The flag is absolutely beautiful. The flag is shaped in a way that makes it look like it's billowing in the wind compared to the flat flags that often appear in the older Warhammer Fantasy kits that look rather static. And lastly, we have our standard Warhammer Fantasy, the old world large square base for monsters and creatures. Now that we've gone through all of the contents, let's take a look at the finished model itself. So here we have the finished Battle Standard Bearer on Royal Pegasus, and I have to say, despite the problems that we're going to get into in a minute, and the various frustrations that this model caused me while putting it together, I have to say the final result is absolutely beautiful. This is, by far, one of Games Workshop's most beautiful recent monster sculpts, and that is really saying something. The way that the horse is rearing naturally, the way the fur and feathers look on the body and wings, and once this model is fully assembled, the standard bearer holding the flag aloft really ties the entire mini together. It is absolutely a beautiful centerpiece model, and I could have definitely have seen it released when Warhammer Fantasy was still being produced by Games Workshop. Now, before we start with talking about my various concerns and criticisms of putting this model together, I just want to say that yes, I did do a head swap for one of my extra helmets that came with my Pegasus Knights kit. This piece does not come with this model itself. It only comes with the bare head. I just want to clear that up for those watching. I wasn't a fan of the head that comes stock with this model, so I felt that a head swap was necessary. And despite the almost 20-year age gap between these two models, the head swap looks pretty seamless. Doing a few 360s of the model, I'll be going over a few of the issues that I have with this kit, as normally I would be saying how good the build was and how much I enjoyed it with most Games Workshop models that I put together, but this one was definitely an outlier. So the first and foremost issue I have with this kit is that putting it together was an absolute nightmare. The build requires exact precise fitting on many of the parts in order to complete the build, something that the instructions do not articulate. Furthermore, it seems that the designers went out of their way to break the model up into the most infuriating amount of tiny bits and pieces as physically possible. The Pegasus's mane are all separate tiny pieces that have to be assembled in the exact order or they won't fit or they won't look right. The rider himself is made up of numerous exact fitting tiny pieces, cluttered with detail that are easily blocked and obscured with the glue necessary to make everything fit. The Pegasus's wings must be slotted in exactly or they won't fit as well. This exact fit being a precise spot that's only found after you attempt to jam them in several times. But by far the worst part of this build have to be the reins. Oh my goodness, the reins. The reins of this build are absolutely infuriating. They're made of tiny, thin plastic. Mine snapped trying to remove them from the runner, already leaving them in pieces before I was even able to attempt to put them together. Additionally, they must be connected to the reins that sit against the Pegasus's. Then both of these must be combined into the tiny, exact hand that's being held by the rider, while the other holds the flag itself. Additionally, Games Workshop has started to point out that you should separate models in order to paint them properly. However, if you install the fleur-de-lis piece on the saddle itself, it locks the rider into place, making you unable to remove him from the saddle. It took me several attempts, each making them look worse than the last, to actually get it to look like this. And as you can see, the reins itself do not look convincing in the slightest. The fact that all of these pieces are joined together in the rider's hand is absolutely infuriating. I felt like smaller reins or skipping the reins altogether and having the paladin hold a sword would look a lot better. Surely not the most realistic, but we're dealing with a magical swordsman riding on a horse with giant wings here. But I definitely feel like this is an area where this kit struggles the most. Additionally, the model is covered in tiny, almost pointless details that sure, they look nice if they survive the assembly and cutting process, but the model itself is covered in tiny locks, keys, and other decorations that will snap off purely just by handling and cutting the parts off to glue onto the model itself. I lost countless bits off the flag and mount purely just by trying to put the model together, as numerous of these tiny keys and locks have broken off the model as I put it together, and I have a feeling you will too, attempting to assemble this model. And last but not least, my last major gripe for this model is the lack of options. For a hero model that is definitely meant to be a centerpiece, there are no real alternate parts. There are no solid transfers for the flag in terms of symbols. There's no helmet or alternate faces for the standard bearer himself, which is why I swapped the helmet on mine. No alternate wing poses for the Pegasus. No option to repose the mount at all to make it flying despite the gigantic wings. And it's a shame that for a flying mount, especially one that is marketed as a different model from the Duke on Royal Pegasus, this build is 90% identical to that one in every way, outside of a small tiny replacement head, which is frankly nearly identical outside of a small crest on the forehead. But you can't change the pose, or actually make the horse fly with an alternate body or wings, or anything major, and it feels like a missed opportunity to not be able to make your Pegasus fly, much like the older Pegasi models. These lack of options outside of a few tiny detail pieces, which frankly look very weird when glued on in general, is definitely a shame. What do I like about this model? Good question. Honestly, after the nightmare to put it together, I have to say that this looks genuinely beautiful once it's done. The banner flowing back looks great. The Pegasus itself looks majestic and the rider is decently posed. It looks like an attention drawing model, and it looks leaps and bounds better than the old reissued Pegasus Knights models. Additionally, if you wanted to, the Pegasus itself could be easily used as a conversion base for a Bretonnian hero, king, duke, or other noble character in your army, if you don't want it to be a standard bearer. And it might be possible to reuse the arm for the flag on a Knight of the Realm on horseback if you wanted to. But most of this model's points comes from how good it looks. If you want something to really stand out in your army, or are looking for a fantasy model to paint or add to your collection, or for use in games like Dungeons & Dragons or other fantasy games, you might enjoy this model, if you can manage to put it together without losing your sanity. Some grief can definitely be saved if you use jewelry chain or another form of chain instead for the reins. Something which I plan to do and show off in another video for my models. Now on to some size comparisons. Our first size comparison is between the classic Bretonnian Pegasus Knights and our standard bearer on Royal Pegasus. As you can see, the size difference between these two is dramatic to say the absolute least. The sculpts are certainly a bit jarring given the 20 years age gap seeing these two next to each other. Sure, the Pegasus Knight is a classic sculpt, but compared to the new release here, it is almost no contest. The riders, though, however, are thankfully on a similar scale, and as such, their bits are roughly compatible with each other in the loose sense of the word. As you can see, I used a spare head from the Pegasus Knights kit on my standard bearer, and it doesn't look that out of place. The size difference isn't terrible between the knights and their parts, but it is definitely noticeable. Our next size comparison is between two dwarf models. One of these is from the Dwarf Cannon multi-part plastic kit, and the other is a musician from the Battle of Skull Pass box set. And as expected, the Pegasus towers over both of these models, as it rightfully should, being a centerpiece model. Next, we have the standard bearer on Royal Pegasus compared to a Tau broadside battlesuit for games of Warhammer 40k. And as you can see here, this model really stacks up well against even larger creature and mechanical monsters from 40k. So if you're looking for something roughly of that size. And finally, for our last major size comparison, we have the Royal Pegasus compared to the mighty plastic Arachnarok spider kit. As you can see, even against the giant spider, the Royal Pegasus really manages to keep its stature and presence, even around these large and gigantic monster kits. For the build category, this model scores a low 1 out of 5. The build itself is teeth-grindingly difficult. The sub-assemblies don't want to cooperate, the reins do not cooperate, and it feels like this whole model itself does not want to cooperate with being put together. The knight sitting on the Pegasus himself is also really frustrating to put together, given the exact fit of some of the pieces, and especially to get it to look right. And overall, the build is a stressful mess to try to get into the correct pose and position. This model definitely feels like it does everything in its power to not cooperate. That being said, if I could give this model more than a 5 out of 5 in the looks category, I certainly would. What detailed parts survive the assembly process do bring out a lot of character, and this model has a lot of presence and is an attention getter from across the table. And in this category, it rewards the builder well. Material quality, 3 out of 5. The Standard Bearer on Royal Pegasus gets a 3 out of 5 in the material qualities category. Despite the usual high-quality plastic of Games Workshop models, I noticed that the plastic on some of the parts, especially the more delicate parts like the dagger, sword, reins, and other small details, really are beyond weak, even for Games Workshop standards. I broke several pieces of the reins and some of the smaller decorative bits, especially around the flag, just by clipping the parts out of the runners themselves, and just by handling them. Perhaps I got a bad copy with weak plastic, but overall this model definitely felt lackluster to build and assemble. Accessories and decals, 2 out of 5. Again, this model scores low in the accessories and decal department. For a big hero model, there's really no options or changeable parts, outside of a few tiny decorative bits and an alternate horse head. No alternate bits outside of a few small dagger and sword pieces. There are no alternate poses, no flying stands, no alternate heads or helmets. So honestly, what you see on the box is what you get. The decal sheet is okay, but for a banner this royal, you would expect better, especially some generic Bretonnian symbols or some of the more complicated army symbols. Instructions, 1 out of 5. And finally, this kit gets a 1 out of 5 in the instruction category. These instructions feel like they were printed in, ironically enough, 2004, as they are barely any help in assembling this model. And as creature models go, they often require exact tight fits with precise handling, and these instructions are incredibly vague and have barely any help in showing where the parts are supposed to go and how they're supposed to line up. They are not helpful, and I found myself looking more at reference images of completed models than I did the included instructions, which is a shame because normally Games Workshop instructions are very helpful. So, would I recommend the Bretonnian Standard Bearer on Royal Pegasus? Honestly, I wouldn't, which is quite a first for me, as I'm usually pretty eager to recommend Games Workshop models. The build is so awful, it's not even funny. The plastic quality is poor, the instructions are unhelpful, and the lack of alternate bits and poses do really leave a sour taste in your mouth. The overall build is beautiful. I will give this model that. It's one of the things that originally drew this model to me. And that being said, after the build is complete, it does look really nice. It really has a presence that no other Games Workshop model outside of the Duke on Royal Pegasus matches currently. So in the looks department, it is really beautiful and stunning, especially among the other older Bretonnian models. However, it is an absolute nightmare to get it to go together. And for the price point that this model commands, I definitely would avoid it. Which is a shame. I was so eager to put this model together, but the overall build and the fragile nature of a lot of the parts really put me off this build, and it was an overall frustrating experience. If you must have this kit, getting a copy off of a discount retailer or eBay would definitely be the way to go, so you don't have to pay the full price of this miniature out of your pocket, as the build certainly is very punishing and not enjoyable. But if you can get past all of that, it may make a worthy addition to your Bretonnian collection. You'd be better off kit bashing your own Standard Bearer on Royal Pegasus, especially out of the Bretonnian Knights of the Realm box and the Pegasus Knight box.